Comments lingering from last time or times before? All right, so let's sort of set where we are historically, and then we'll kind of move along. So where we left off last week was around 107 AD with St. Ignatius of Antioch as a martyr to the Emperor Trajan. All right, and so then we're kind of moving along a little bit beyond that. So then we're going to cover the sort of the three emperors today, very specifically, and you'll see why we're doing that. So it goes from Trajan to Hadrian to Antonius Pius to Marcus Aurelius, who maybe one of the more famous emperors. So during that time, there's this sort of movement in Rome from we talked about last time about Trajan and his very willingly wanting to take Ignatius to the circus because they're literal bread and circuses sort of mentality of entertaining the masses. And then the Emperor Hadrian comes along and the persecutions slow down a lot, and he just sort of says, if they're not bothering anyone, just kind of leave them alone. And then Antonius Pius is the next emperor, and he is sort of in the line of Plato or Aristotle's philosopher king. Not the greatest administrator, but a man of character and a man of virtue. And in the end, he ends up adopting Marcus Aurelius, who then becomes the next emperor. And you've probably heard of him. His meditations are sort of he's probably the most, next to maybe Cicero's, like the most famous Stoic philosopher. Okay, so there's this movement in Rome towards philosophy. Okay, so and suppose this sort of dependence on reason. So, and we'll come back to this at the end, why this is important when we sort of try to read the signs of the times. But it's no accident that at the same time there is this man who is also a philosopher, who's from Samaria. Although this time Samaria is no longer Jewish, so that the temple has been destroyed, the Jews have been dispersed, and so Justin is a Samaritan, but a Gentile. His family lives there, and so he's a Roman citizen. He's born around the year 100, so just slightly before where we left off last time, and he dies in the year 165. Then you can guess sort of by his name how he ends up dying, which we'll talk about in a minute. So anyway, so there's this sort of almost like a Renaissance before the Renaissance of Greek thought, where it really, and it never really left. But it's now, with the emperors sort of turning in that direction, it begins to make a little more sense, okay? All right, so Justin himself, all right? So Justin had very little exposure, probably, to Judaism at all. No exposure to Christianity, but he was a philosopher. And for him, he's trying to find the true philosophy, okay? And so he's moving along. So he first goes to the Stoics, and he finds that while they have an emphasis on virtue and natural law, they say nothing about God, and that's what he wants to know about. Okay, and so he moves from the Stoics, and then he goes to whatever at the time were called Peripatetics or Aristotelians, and so he moves to this Aristotelian, and he meets with him a little bit, and the Aristotelian asks for money, and he's like, well, any philosopher asks for money, I don't want any part of his philosophy. So he moves away from him and goes to the Pythagoreans, but the teacher there says, well, you got to learn geometry, you've got to learn astronomy, you got to learn all these things before we can even begin. And he goes, I don't think so. So then he moves to he finds a Platonist. And so he touches all of the major philosophies of the time. Okay, 99.9% of all the philosophy going around at the time fall into those four categories. So he goes to the Platonists, and he begins to see that there's a lot of truth there, particularly because it has something to say about God. All right, and so he sort of thinks, well, this is the true philosophy. Then he's walking on the beach one day, and he meets this old man. And this old man begins to tell him about the prophets. And he begins to read the prophets. And he realizes that Plato's not the true philosophy. He realizes that Christianity is the true philosophy. Okay? So that's where he's coming from, right? He never saw himself as anything other than a philosopher. In fact, after he converts, he starts his own philosophy school. And he goes to Rome to teach Christian philosophy, which is pretty bold. We'll see why in just a second. Okay, so that's sort of his background, all right? What I want to talk about is a little bit about just philosophy in general at the time, to make sure we sort of understand. So modern philosophy we think about in terms of just ideas, right? For the ancients, it was a way of life, okay? In fact, as time goes on a little bit, people will very often be drawn to Christianity simply as a philosophy because it has practical applications. Okay, so many of the Gentiles are drawn to it because they look at the people and they're like, that has to be the true philosophy because they're all virtuous. All right, so there's a sort of backdoor way into it. So that's what they're looking for. They're not looking for ideas. They're looking for ways of life. All right, so it's philosophy in a much broader sense. It's much more practical than we would call philosophy today. But at the same time, providentially, that now many of these pagans are attacking the church, right? And so the church needs a way to defend herself, right? And so, again, if we look sort of providentially, St. Justin is being raised up at this particular time in history for a very specific reason. Okay, so think St. Augustine before St. Augustine. Okay, he's that on that level of sort of philosophical acumen. All right, he wrote 3 sort of major works that we have. He probably wrote much more in full, and it's his first apology, which he sent directly to the emperor. It was Antonius Pius at the time. And then his second apology, which he sends to Marcus Aurelius, which is the one that ultimately gets him in trouble. And then he has this dialogue with Trypho, in which Trypho is a Jew, and he's trying to convince him of the truth of Christianity, starting on the basis of Judaism. All right, so you see, he sort of covers the whole gamut, right? He can move from the sort of the Gentiles to the truth of Christianity, and he can move from Judaism to the truth of Christianity. Right? So what I want to talk about is his viewpoint, though. So in this quote, it's a little long. I just want to focus on the part in italics. He says, "I found this philosophy alone to be safe and profitable. Thus, and for this reason, I am a philosopher." All right? So he never saw himself as anything other than a lover of wisdom, which is what philosophy means. The word philosophy means to love wisdom. All right. And so, what did he think? He thinks, well, okay, where can I find wisdom? All right. So that's his goal. All right. So let's move from there, and then we'll move into what's going on here. Okay. All right. So he begins in this dialogue with Trypho. He's trying to convince him of the truth of Christianity on his own terms, on Trypho's own terms. It says, "Accordingly, we who have received gifts from Christ, who has ascended up on high, prove from the words of prophecy that you, the wise in yourselves and the men of understanding in your own eyes, prove that you are foolish and honor God and his Christ by lip only. But we who are instructed in the whole truth honor them both in acts and in knowledge and in heart, even unto death. But you hesitate to confess that he is Christ, as the scriptures and the events witnessed and done in his name prove." So what's he talking about, and why does this matter? Right? So he's talking about the prophets, right? And so if you read the dialogue, he goes step by step through the prophets, talking about all the reasons why Jesus is the Messiah. Right? So once he sort of goes through this conversion, he goes back to the scriptures, right? But it's not that he he went back to begin with, that for him is a motive of credibility. And that's what I want to sort of talk about, all right? So, Catechism talks about motives of credibility. I want to spend some time talking about this. Here's what the paragraph 156 says. What moves us to believe is not the fact that revealed truths appear as true and intelligible in light of our natural reason. Right? So what I want to sort of frame here is for us to begin to think about, prior to conversion, what moves someone along? Okay, so tracing St. Justin, right? What is it that moves? Is it just grace, or is there something else going on? All right. What moves us to believe is not the fact that revealed truths appear as true and intelligible in the light of our natural reason. Right? So that's not it. Catechism says it's not that you look at some revealed truth and go, "Oh, that makes sense. Okay, I'm good." All right. We believe because of the authority of God Himself, who reveals them, who can neither deceive nor be deceived, so that the submission of our faith might nevertheless be in accordance with reason. God willed that external proofs of His revelation should be joined to the internal helps of the Holy Spirit. So external things happening outside of what's going on inside that confirm the revelation. All right, this is what are called the motives of credibility. And it lists four of them. The miracles of Christ and the saints, prophecies, the church's growth and holiness, and her fruitfulness and stability are the most certain signs of divine revelation, adapted to the intelligence of all. They are motives of credibility, which show that the assent of faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. All right, so we'll sort of back up from the bottom up. All right, so very often people will say that, in essence, that this is fideism. You just believe, you're just making a blind act of trust. All right, but what the church wants us to realize is that it's not a blind act of trust. All right, there's these reasons why we should believe. And the four of them are really important, so we're going to sort of back up just a little bit, okay? So, the first one it talks about are the miracles of Christ. All right, so these are a little bit, obviously, more easy for someone like St. Justin, who's hearing them sort of from people who heard them from people who saw them. For us, maybe not as profound as a motive of credibility until we go into the scriptures and we realize that what does Jesus call his miracles?
Signs.
Signs. Why does he call them signs? Like John's gospel. Why in John's gospel does he just, as a matter of fact, say, he changed the bread and the fish and he multiplied it? Why? He just says, as a matter of fact, and it just goes on. Like, if you were there, wouldn't you want to know how he did it? Like, wouldn't that be kind of cool to see? But he doesn't focus on that. Why? Yes?
Because it sort of wants us to keep moving to see where Jesus is going and not just try to dig into that.
That's part of it, right? I mean, it's not just for us to be curious about it, but they're meant to be signs of something very, like, Jesus could have done miracles all day long, right? But every miracle he does is like, think of it as a sacrament, a small s sacrament. Think of it as a sign pointing to something, right? So he's saying, okay, when he heals the blind man, right? The blind man can see. But Mark places that in this context of how blind the apostles still are who Jesus is. Right? So it's showing how physical blindness doesn't always equate to spiritual blindness, and vice versa. Right? Or using John's example, right? John 6 is a great example, right? So we talked about this last week. So he let's go back to where it's even clearer in when Jesus cleans the temple in John's gospel. What's the first question they ask him? You know? They don't go, dude, what did you do? You made a mess. Like, how dare you? They don't say any of that, right? They say, what sign do you give for doing this? Right? What are you going to do to prove that, we're waiting for the new Messiah, for the new Moses to come clean out the temple? What sign are you going to give us that you're him? All right. So, and he says, the sign will be destroy this temple. The sign will be the resurrection. Right. And they jump ahead to John 6, and he said they go to after he after he multiplies the bread and the fish, and they say, well, Moses did this too, and he says, are you just, do you want to see signs, or do you want to see what they're pointing to? Okay, so this idea of looking at miracles as to what they're pointing to is really an important part. All right, and we can fast forward to our own time, right? Like, think about the miracle of the sun. Okay, what is that sign pointing to? Right, the miracle in and of itself is meaningless until you attach the fact that it's a sign pointing to something. Right? Is the sun approaching the earth that way? Does that mean they're on the brink of destruction? What does it mean? What does the sign itself mean? All right. So back to the point. So these miracles as signs, which ties into the prophecies, right? So Jesus' miracles and signs are pointing to things that were promised. All right, and this power of the prophets was really profound for them. Okay, just understanding that, over and over and over again, Jesus fulfills prophecies. All right, I mean, God, He calls a shot, and then there He is, right, and He does the thing. Okay, and that is a gigantic mode of credibility, because you can say all you want about, the resurrection didn't really happen, all this stuff, but what you can't answer is all of the signs that He fulfilled that were written hundreds of years before. Okay, so prophecy is an important aspect, and we'll talk about this in a second, how it ties to when we look at other religions, okay? The one that is bigger, and yes?
Is there still something to be said for a blind surrender, though, in the spiritual life?
Can we answer that question at the end? Because in the end, there's a chasm, right? There's always a chasm that you have to cross, right? That you can't go. What this is getting at is more of why it is so reasonable to believe. So in other words, we have to wait the grace of conversion. But like we've talked about so many times before, our role then in that is to clear out all the obstacles, right? Which is exactly what St. Justin did, right? He had cleared out every single obstacle in the way of conversion. And then when the grace was there, when he meets this mysterious man, he's every obstacle that he could possibly have, he had gotten rid of. Because he wanted the truth. Right? So there is always going to be this leap. But what I want to sort of make sure we understand, because the church wouldn't have understood it this way pretty much ever, it's not sort of this, it's not based upon more of mysticism, it's based more on reason. All right, so we move from the miracles, and St. Thomas says, he's like, well, why have the miracles? Why don't we have all the miracles that we had, like in the early church? I mean, left and right? We read after miracle after miracle, miracle, and saints still perform miracles. We still see big public miracles, but they're just not there. And what St. Thomas says is because we have the church, and what he wants us to begin to see is that the church itself is a miracle. Okay, and this would have been something that St. Justin he mentions, but he mentions the spread of it. All right, what we're more interested in is not just the spread of it, but the longevity of it. All right, because you have to be able to answer the question as to why 12 men started this group of people that somehow expanded, touched every place in the world, left it completely different, and it's now over 1 billion people. All right, you have to. That is a real historical problem that you have to be able to answer. Okay, it speaks definitively to the truth of the church. And so the church in and of itself, the fact that anything could last that long, from its beginnings to its stumblings, I mean, it happens it grows during persecution, right? Like, it's illegal. You can be killed for it, and yet it still grows. It calls you to do stuff that everything in you says, I don't want to do that. And yet it still grows, right? And somehow, 2,000 years later, it's still here. That is a huge, if I'm just looking at data, that's a huge, huge reason why you should believe. All right? It's not belief in of itself, but it ought to clear away a lot of obstacles. Right? And that's what this idea of motives of credibility are. Okay? Does that make sense? All right, so we're trying to show here, along with St. Justin, why it's reasonable to believe. Okay? And why it's reasonable not just to believe in God like Plato, but reasonable to believe in Jesus Christ. All right, does that make sense? All right. So, if longevity is the thing, then why not Islam? I'll see if you guys grasp what we just talked about.
I mean, from the very beginning of Islam, there was an immediate split and decision about whether or not they even had a successor to lead the religion.
Okay, so unity and order is part of it, which you can see now there's marks of the church, why we have marks of the church, right? What were you going to say?
I was actually going to say, either if isn't it possible to say because if we're talking about longevity, Confucianism and Hinduism's older than Christianity, and Zoroastrianism and I was almost going to say the Egyptian religion, but that's a dead religion now. But it's that's still practiced today by Hindus and by Buddhists. So it seems like you can't necessarily be the endurance should be a factor, but it doesn't automatically by itself because there's two contradicting completely worldviews. That one is older than Christianity, and yet they can't both be equally true because they have different propositions.
Right. So everybody sort of grasps that. So what we're sort of getting at is it's all of these things together. It's these four things together. Right. So why is Islam not the true religion? Well, it's spread by the sword. No prophet said Muhammad was coming. Right. He wasn't accompanied by miracles the way Christ was. So you see, longevity isn't enough. Okay. It's all of those that make it reasonable. Okay. And we shouldn't poo-poo prophecy for that reason, because most of these things were predicted long before they happened. Long before. Right? Even just looking at the book of Daniel, right? I mean, he nails it. 500 years before, almost down to the exact day that the Messiah would appear. That's amazing. And that going back to the miracle of the sun, right? Even if we look at that, right? These ignorant little children were able to tell exactly the day and the time that this thing would happen, right? Now, how it happened, doesn't matter. The miracle is not in the fact that the sun came. The miracle is in the fact that those children predicted it. Okay. Because there's a lot of people who try to debunk it and go, oh, well, we can make a natural explanation for it. That's fine. If you can make a natural explanation for it, fine. Can you make a natural explanation for how these children knew exactly the day and the time it was going to happen? Right? So that sort of debunking of the miraculous, you always have to go back to, I don't know, what is it? Jesus walked on water because the density of the Dead Sea is something. I've heard all these ridiculous things like that. And then that's fine, but, if that was the case, then why did Peter sink and him not sink? Yes.
Yeah, it's like Padre Pio. He has a lot of miracles that are confirmed and documented and scientifically proven because he's within the last 100 years. And there's a miracle where just going to pilgrimage to see him, this girl who was blind and had no pupils was then able to see. And then people give scientific explanation about it, saying that there's some condition where you can have no pupils, but then through small holes in your irises, you're able to see, and if it's refracted correctly, then you'll be able to see partially through the light that comes through those holes. But she couldn't see anything at all before she went within a quarter mile of Padre Pio, and then suddenly she can see.
Yeah, and that's an important. So, what is the reasonable thing to conclude there? It's not proof, but what is the reasonable thing to conclude there? Something happened, right? Something happened in that moment, and that's. I mean, I think we downplay, especially as Catholics, we downplay the power of the miraculous. like for setting seeds in people, right? Like, if you really want to send someone stirring, ask them about the tilma from Our Lady of Guadalupe, right? They know a little bit about the story. First of all, it's amazing that it's basically like a potato sack. 20, 30 years, maybe max lasts. This thing was hung up in a church, not protected, incense going around. A bomb exploded in front of it. Still looks exactly the same as that day that it was done. Oh, and when you look at the thing and you try to figure out can't figure out, that's not paint on there. What is that? Oh, and if you look really closely, you can actually see the image in her eye of the bishop looking at the flowers. So, like, learn these things is really important. It's not a matter of curiosity, but it begins to get the sort of the ball rolling and going, wait a second. Like, you've got to answer that. You've got to answer why there's this little girl who died 1,700 years ago whose body still isn't corrupt. Why? How can that happen? Like, what is the explanation for that, right? And that begins to, now you go, okay, well, this begins to make a little bit of sense, right? All right, so this idea then of appealing to reason, all right? Why? Why do we do that? Okay, why do we do that as Christians? Or why ought we to do that? So here's what St. Justin says. Our teachings appear to be greater than every human teaching by the entire rational principle having become Jesus Christ, who appeared for our salvation in body, reason, and soul. Whatever things were well spoken by philosophers and legislators, they did so by participating in the Logos, either by discovery or theory. But since they did not know the Logos completely, who is Christ, they often said contradictory things. All right, so what is he talking about, the Logos? How many people have heard Christ called the Logos? Okay, so everyone know what Logos is? Logos is where we get the word logic from. It's just right reason, okay? And so what he's saying is that Jesus, who we call the Son, that we also call the Word, which we're going to talk in just a second what that actually means, is reason, right reason incarnate. And so we shouldn't be surprised that by participating, even in small ways, the philosophers got things right. Because the things they did do correctly according to reason were just participations in Christ. Okay? The beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. The Greek word is logos. And the word logos was with God, and the word logos was God. All right? So we've read this many, many times, right? But how would a first century Gentile have read that?
Well, especially if he was familiar with the Greek traditions, he would have been familiar with the struggle between the Platonic philosophies and the Aristotelian philosophies, and resolving how something could be both an ultimate cause and an efficient cause. Plato was like, there's a demiurge that is the efficient cause, but not necessarily the ultimate cause, right? And the Aristotle was like, no, there is one, but he is the ultimate cause, but not necessarily the efficient cause. So they had to find some way of explaining them both. And then John came in and was like, this person is both the ultimate cause and the efficient cause, and his very nature is love and logos. Okay.
Everybody sort of follow that? I mean, he went, like he nailed it. But his point, the point is that a Greek would read this and go, I know of the Logos. But the Logos is just a creature, right? Now we begin to see why he's making the argument the way he is, right? So they would say that the Logos is just the one who, just this creature, maybe a lesser god, maybe not, who took the eternally existing matter and formed it into stuff. Okay? So they would have said, okay, well but what is this here about that he was with God in the beginning? First of all, what beginning? We don't believe in any beginning. Right? Everything is eternal. And then to say that he was God. Right? Not just a helper of God. Right? And you see why there's so many heresies along the lines that are sort of subordinating Christ to the Father. And so when we read this, we begin to think that, again, it's meant for us to grasp that God, in and of himself, is reasonable. Okay, he follows reason, which, again, to other religions and especially to the Greeks would be. I mean, they wouldn't believe that at all. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about. So this idea then has consequences. All right. And so what's the first consequence? All right. So Tertullian says, "Reason is a thing of God, inasmuch as there is nothing which God, the maker of all, has not provided, disposed, ordained by reason. Nothing which he has not willed should be handled and understood by reason." All right, so first he's saying that there's nothing that which God, the maker of all, has not provided, disposed, or ordained by reason. What does he mean by that? Yes, Con?
God has ordered all things according to reason.
Yes, all things, right? So that would have been completely and totally a foreign idea to them. Because they believed, first of all, that everything they saw was just from chaos, sort of melded together and put. All right, everything was living. Everything had its own, like the planets moved, and they had all different reasons for why the planets moved in an elliptical form. They said, well, the ellipsis is a perfect shape, and they like it. Like the apple falls to the ground because it loves the center of the earth. Right, so that they tried to, because they didn't personify reason, they had to personify everything else. Okay? And that's really important, right? Because it has serious consequences for when you begin to see. So, someone like Aristotle. Well, if the world is eternal, what are some of the consequences of that?
If you're dead, then that's...
Yeah, well, there's that.
Yeah.
But even from like, what changes about the world if the world is eternal?
There's no beginning.
Yeah, that's sort of what eternal means, because
There's no end.
There's no end.
There's
No end in the time sense, or in the sense of a reason for having been made, right?
there's no point.
There's no point in any of it, right? And that's what they thought, right? They just thought and they'd say, well, it just keeps recycling and circling back around. Because if it's infinite, it goes on forever. That's what it does, right? And so what happens? Well, you drink, be married, and tomorrow you die. What's the point of anything? What's the point of me studying how the moon stays close to the earth if tomorrow it may decide that it doesn't like the earth anymore and runs away? Right? So if things are not governed by reason, then there's no reason for anything. So the reason why I'm sort of pounding this into the ground is because there's the myth that somehow Christianity and science are in conflict. But science absolutely depends on Christianity. It's not an accident that it arose when it did, where it did, and how it did. Right? There's no such thing as science in the ancient world. Okay? There's no such thing in science as science in the Islamic world. Why? Because their idea of God has consequences. If God's capricious, why bother studying anything He made? All right. If you're in China and you see this in their culture, right, in Confucianism, right, they think the past is always better than now. So if we're going away from something, why bother? Right? And you see this in their culture. Right? You see this when they develop gunpowder, but then they don't actually use it. Right? And they develop cannons and they don't actually use them to defend themselves. Because and they invented a watch long before anybody invented a watch, but they saw it as progress and so they destroyed it. And that's all because of their religious beliefs, all right? And so we have to sort of understand that when somebody, when you try to put Christianity in conflict with science, guess who's going to end up on the losing end of that?
Science.
Science, right? Because eventually you're going to go, wait, why are we studying this anyway? Like, how do I know that this actually follows that principle? And how do I even know my mind is a reliable, like, maybe I'm just being totally deceived. And so that's the direction you can end up going if you throw the baby out with that water. Right? And the church fathers knew this, right? They knew what they were giving to the world. And they weren't scared of it, right? They weren't scared of engaging. Yes, Con?
So basically, I mean, you were saying like the modern philosophical approach to science of the world is kind of anarchy and just the Big Bang happened and things happen to arise and we're studying those things is not grounded on any solid philosophy because if you don't believe the world invested in reason, there's no reason, then you should have reason.
Yeah, but over time, what happens then? I mean, it's hard for us to even imagine this because we're sort of living in the residuals of like the post-Christian culture. But eventually, people will stop even bothering. Right? They'll be satiated enough that they'll be like, why bother? And you already see people have this attitude, right? Like they're like, I don't know. I was looking on Yelp at the Grand Canyon, and I couldn't believe how many people were like, it's just a big hole in the ground. And I can't use that. I don't really care how it got there. It's not interesting to me. So what? There's a movement towards that when you get away from Christianity, well, it's a gravity that will happen. It's a law of gravity. Yes, Con?
Do you think it's manifesting first in people's attitude towards religion in terms of this kind of, you have a rise of people that are just like, whatever, it's maybe there is, maybe there isn't? Maybe. I think, if nothing else, it manifests itself in a rejection of reason in and of itself, right? So that's why I spend so much time on the motives of credibility, because most people would say it's totally unreasonable to believe in God. Like, where is he? I can't see him, I can't measure him, I can't. And we'll talk more about this sort of at the end when we talk about Pope Benedict's sort of response, but like the church is the only one left that is defending human reason now. Okay, so philosophy, you guys know this, if you take philosophy classes here, they're all over the place, right? Because they're outside of the Christian tradition. All right, okay, so let's sort of now build into this a little bit about the role of reason in faith. And so we jump to, you're in the 1 Corinthians, and there's tons of examples of this. If there's no resurrection of the dead, then neither has Christ been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then empty too is our preaching, empty too your faith. Then we are also false witnesses to God, because we testified against God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, neither has Christ been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is in vain. You are still in your sins. Okay, so we believe that that's revelation, right? Could we have figured that out on our own?
Yes.
Absolutely, right? It's just logic, right? All he's saying is, if P, then Q, and he's saying if not Q, then not P, right? Simple logic. All right, so if we can figure it out on our own, why does God give it to us? Right? Bible's pretty, in the grand scheme of, all the stuff we have to learn and figure out about God, there's not a page wasted in Scripture. So why does he give us that? I think this is a good question for us to sort of wrestle with for a few minutes, to think about.
Is it, I have that question because I feel like sometimes, I wonder if because with this passage that gets brought up sometimes in conversations like this, I wonder if, because it's interesting that he ends it saying, you're still in your sins. He's not, I feel like sometimes we're putting ourselves, which this is kind of like, you can't escape it. Our 21st century context is kind of reading it in like, oh, therefore no God. But he doesn't say that. He says Christianity is true, or Jesus is a false Messiah. So it seems to be like Judaism would still be true, but there's no atonement that's been made for you. So you're still in your sins.
Yeah, so there's that part of it, that, but it doesn't add anything to what's already there, right? So we already knew that, right? So remember, every single word of Scripture, like we got to believe this with all our heart, right? Like, God, my word does not return to me void, right? Living and active, every single word. What ultimately is God trying to reveal to us here? Yes?
Showing the foundational awareness of reason in Christian tradition.
Yes, it's showing reason can be trusted, right? Especially reason illumined by faith, right? Reason that has been enlightened by faith, has been purified by faith, is reliable, right? And that's really, really important for us to grasp. Because once you grasp that, everything begins to change, right? We don't reject philosophy at all, right? We say, okay, philosophy is what the church thinks, the handmaiden of theology, at the service of theology. Science becomes the handmaiden of theology, because when it's based on solid reasoning, it's good, it's helpful, right? Because ultimately, going back to St. Justin's point, right, the whole purpose of it is to find out about God, right? To find out who God is, who I am in God, and what our relationship is, right? So that's why when we jump ahead 50 years later, St. Clement of Alexandria, sort of in the same school as St. Justin Martyr, he develops in Alexandria, Egypt, he develops a catechetical school where he teaches Christian philosophy. And again, to call it Christian philosophy, for him, there was no difference between philosophy and theology. Okay? And here's what he says about it. He says, accordingly, before the advent of the Lord, philosophy was necessary to the Greeks for righteousness. And now it becomes conducive to piety. And so we see what he's saying here, that in a certain sense, the Greeks had their own prophets. Right? Now, they were acting under divine inspiration in the sense that the prophets were in Judaism, but they were still prophets. Right? And now it becomes conducive to piety. So he's saying we have to study philosophy. If we want to be holy, we have to know philosophy, being a kind of preparatory training to those who attain to faith through demonstration. Perchance, too, philosophy was given to the Greeks directly and primarily so the Lord should call the Greeks. For this was a schoolmaster to bring the Hellenic mind as the law, the Hebrews to Christ. Philosophy, therefore, was a preparation paving the way for him who was perfected in Christ. Yes?
Would we say that it's like Greek philosophers who, like Aristotle or someone who was influenced very heavily by Aquinas and like got a lot of things right? Would we say that they deduced that like entirely through natural reason, or was there grace along the way helping them to make those advances?
Actual grace?
Actually, it's not necessarily sanctifying, or
yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any reason you couldn't say that there's actual grace enlightening their minds. You obviously wouldn't go so far as to say sanctifying grace, but you could say that the truth as they knew and understood it, for them holding to it, could be a source of grace to them, right? Like, because they're still saved in who? Here's the point. The Logos, right? They've come in a different direction. They don't have the benefit of divine revelation the way, direct divine revelation the way that the Jews did. But they're still, this is why, Plato can accidentally talk about this crucified Messiah. Like, where does he get that idea from? Maybe he gets it from the fact that is sort of the part of mankind, right? What's the very first thing that God tells Adam and Eve? Right? After he lets them know what the consequences are, he tells them, "Oh, it's okay, I'm going to save you." Right? First parents, guess what happens? It gets passed down, right? Becomes sort of part of the patrimony. So there's a part of that, but what he's sort of getting at is that this is the best they had, but it was moving. God wasn't abandoning them; He was just coming at them from a different direction. Right? Does that make sense? This is why, too. It's I think it's definitely St. Justin, and I think in the end, I think they're wrong, but and even Augustine talked about Plato must have had access to the scriptures somewhere. He must have known of Moses. And vice versa, if you read like the Book of Wisdom, you can see that clearly there's this sort of influence of Greek philosophy there as well, when they talk about things like the cardinal virtues. All right, so I don't want to go real deep into this, but I want to sort of ask us to sort of look at like the ideas have consequences approach, okay? You guys sort of know the story of Plato's cave. Okay, so there's these universals that put shadows on the wall. The real thing are the universals, and the shadows are not the real things. And at the time, that's totally and completely new and profound. All right, and so think of what he's giving us sort of there in his sort of theory of forms is that each thing has a nature. Okay, it's a little more complicated than that, but if I'm sort of summarizing it very quickly, so he discovers that each thing has a nature, or not specifically that each thing has a nature, but that there's this world where natures exist. Okay, and he says that things in this world, so that chair is just a shadow of the nature in this other world of chair. Okay, but the nature's not actually in the thing. All right, so that's as far as I'm going to take it. All right, so that's what's called Platonic realism. So these universal things exist, but they exist off in another world by themselves. And he never says where that world is, but that has consequences to it. All right, so what are some of the consequences to it? If natures are not in the things themselves.
Oh. Wait, if natures are not in the thing themselves?
If the form is not in the thing itself.
Then what value does the thing have?
You could extend that.
And you just nab it, right?
Yeah.
Like, what value does the thing have? So let's talk about human nature. If the soul is the form of the body, okay, what use is the body?
Was that supposed to be flipped?
No, the soul is the form of the body. Makes the body what it is. Makes it human.
Okay,
yeah. What are the consequences of that? Yeah, the body. Yeah, the body has no meaning to it, right? The body has. All right. So So the body now loses any meaning, right? What I do with the body doesn't matter. What am I constantly? I'm trying to escape the body. Right? This is where this idea comes from, by the way. So when you look at someone like Socrates, right? He thought getting out of the body was a good thing because he'd no longer be hampered by the body. Okay. Now, if everything that exists in this other world, then souls pre-exist the body. All right. And what are the consequences of that? Yes. Go
I
ahead.
have a question before I.
Okay.
This might be more giving you a go, but so if you said human nature, like, is a universe that exists, does everyone have like their own human nature that exists, or just like human nature projects various shadows in each one?
You mean it from the Platonic standpoint?
From the Platonic standpoint.
No, there's one human nature, and everything else is a shadow of that one human nature.
So we would all be shadows of the singular human nature.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a universalist entity that once you die, you go back to, is the Platonic idea of the end.
Yeah, you just basically answered my question. I don't know if you meant to or not. So this would be the reason why they would reject hell, because you didn't go back to where you started from. Right? So you see that there's a lot of like purification that needs to go on, and we could do this forever.
That's a super common belief today.
Yeah, and it comes from that, right? It comes from the universal salvation philosophically has an assumption underneath it, right? And the fact is that reason might take you there, but that's why you have to have faith purifying reason. Okay, and that's why we make the insistence. People are like, well, does it really matter that there's a beginning to the world? Like, yeah, it really matters. Like, that's why it's revealed. Because, yeah, maybe we couldn't figure that out on our own. But it absolutely has incredible consequences to it if there's no beginning of the world. Yes?
So the fact that certain ancient philosophers got things wrong was not necessarily indicative that they failed to follow reason, more so that they could not have revelation, which would have enhanced or would
Both.
have enlightened.
Yeah, it's both. It's both. And you can't factor out the fact that St. Justin even talks about the role the devil plays too. Right? In twisting and turning and spinning things around. And, when you're worshiping false gods who are demons, that's what happens. So there's always some of that as well. And that's the part that's not touched by the Jews. All right, so what's the sort of position of the church? The church is, there are universals, but they're found in the things themselves. So what St. Augustine does is he tries to unite Plato with Christianity and say, his idea that this other world where these forms exist just in like pure form is actually in the mind of God, which is reasonable, right? But the only problem is you have to sort of go to the next step and go, is that human nature? And do I have a human nature, or am I just a shadow of the human nature? And the church would say that you have a human nature.
Can you say that it only exists in the mind of God prior to creation and God's omniscience because he knows all things and cannot not know it? Not that it actually exists substantively, but...
Yeah, so think in the universal terms. So human nature itself exists in the mind of God always, right? Like it doesn't... But the human nature, which he's given to me,
right,
it exists here and in his mind.
Right.
So it's both. Yes?
And just this is my go-to. So like when we say human nature, like how much of you is encompassed in human nature? Like how much? So you said like you have a human nature, I have a human nature, and unlike Platonic realism, they're not the same. Like we each have human natures.
Right, but my human nature is exactly the same as yours.
Okay, so how much of Rob is a part of his human nature? Well, when does like the nature stop in Rob?
Oh, so what differentiates my human nature from yours? Is that what you're asking?
If we had the same human nature, that's fine. But like, what differentiates me from you then? Like where
our bodies.
Our bodies.
That's why it's so important. That's why we spend so much time with theology of the body, right? So the matter is the differentiating principle. That's why we believe that the soul is created at the time the body is created. So that soul is meant to go in that body. So you couldn't have different parents. Like you are who you are because you have that body.
But angels who are pure spirits don't have bodies but are still different.
Yeah, because they have different natures.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, each angel has his own nature.
It's not like there's a nature that is angel. There might be like an angel whose nature is logic or something. I don't know.
Wouldn't our souls be different too?
As forms of the body, I mean, you could say, they're different. But only in the sense that, in the way that the body affects the soul. Remember we talked about this, about, like in your soul, you may have more of the virtue of courage than I have. But in a certain sense, our souls are identical in that regard, but the way this is really getting us off on the tangent, down a rabbit hole. But no, it's not like God just, maybe this will make it clear. God doesn't just have this bucket of souls and he goes and grabs one and throws it in your body. It was made for your body because it was supposed to make your body a human body and it was supposed to be part of you.
And for the time separating your death and the general resurrection, is there anything differentiating our souls at that point? That's one of those mystery things we don't know. Like that kind of talked about, like, well, what happens? Like that's where the idea of like you somehow sleep, but that's probably not feasible because then you got to throw out the intercession of the saints. There is obviously something different about your soul from my soul at that point. But how we sort of would even begin to imagine, I have no idea. And I don't even know that anyone can answer that question. Yes?
I've heard that described as basically your self, like you are clay, and then like your soul is clay. And then when you're created, you're like the body is water, effectively. Or like the physical world, the passions, all that. and then it's kind of molded through your life by how you live, what you choose, all these things. But then death is like a fire, and it hardens and like vitrifies the clay, and then you're molded into this shape that was because of your body and because of your experiences and your choices and everything. And then when the end times come and you're re-entered into your body, into the water of the real world and reality, or the natural world and reality, you don't change shape afterward. You still have the same shape. So presumably you'd have the same shape throughout, even before you're entered back into the body. And that's why you can't change.
And that's why you can say the resurrected body is your body. Right? Because it has your soul in it. Even though the matter is completely the matter of my body is not the same as it was like the day I was born, obviously, right? So there has to be some other sort of unifying principle, and that's it. So and how that, I don't even begin to imagine what that is like, but that's the idea.
How does purgatory work in that analogy?
It's an analogy.
Okay.
Well, so I could add to it a little bit. I could add to it and just say that just because you're hardened doesn't mean you don't have gunk on it stuck to the outside.
Purgatory is the burning fire, or God is the burning fire that hardens at death. And it's a kiln.
Yeah, the idea that purgatory is time, I think, is probably what limits that analogy, but it's not time. You don't experience time as a pure spiritual thing, because experiencing time is experiencing change, and spirits don't change.
Although you do change in purgatory, though. Yeah, there's another degree of time which we can talk about. I don't want to get us. When we talk about last things next week, we'll talk about that. I'll be prepared to go spin everybody in circles. All right, so yes.
Quick on that. Do spirits not change? Or like our spirits?
Bringing us back to the basics.
Now, angels can change.
Okay.
Lucifer fell, his spirit changed, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
It's not always that way too.
They can't anymore. An angel's choice is fixed once it's made it.
Yeah, its will looks like something. It's hardened, but that doesn't mean that it in and of itself, its knowledge grows. That's a change.
I thought.
Read the book of Daniel, where Daniel complains to one of the angels about why he took so long to get there, and he's like, I tried to come, but Michael stopped me.
I mean, I thought all of the knowledge they had was infused at their creation.
No, so they can learn from other beings. Like your guardian angel has no idea whether you're going to be saved or not. Right? So his knowledge will change.
So their
Now,
will
knowledge
is
of
set.
universals won't change. They don't learn the way we learn, one thing after another, but they can learn new things because they can be told them by higher angels. Otherwise, there's no reason for angels to communicate.
So they have a set knowledge of transcendentals, but then specific incidental things.
Perhaps, but they can
They
even
may learn.
Standard package.
Yeah, but that's why the angelic, it's a hierarchy too, is so that they can communicate with each other.
But aren't they outside of time? So how does that work with acquiring?
Yeah, so they're not. So this is the part that we probably need to. So they're not technically outside of time. So time is just different. So time is not necessarily a thing. Time is just the way we measure change here, and only God, who is changeless, is technically outside of time. And I'll just leave that for you to sit with, because they do have something like time, not the way we experience it, right? So, an angel, that angel in the book of Daniel, right, he knew that Daniel was talking to him, telling him to come on, and he knew that Michael was holding him there for a certain amount of time. In fact, he says, he held me for 28 days. So there is something like time. But St. Thomas calls it ab eternity, is what he calls it. But there is something like time.
Yeah.
And if anyone raises their hand about this, one more question, I'm going to just keep going. All right. So no, I have no idea where I was going with it. All right, so there's different ways we could sort of approach this, right? And this is what the church was facing, okay? So we have Tertullian. His approach is to, and I'm going to go through this a little quickly because I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. his approach is to throw it out. All right, so he says, no, they got stuff wrong. We got to throw it out. All right, so his is a fideism, okay, and he's not the last person to do this. Okay, this is sort of at the heart of what Luther tried to do. Okay, so Luther didn't just throw out the church; he threw out philosophy too. All right, and he's the reason sort of why philosophy went the direction it did. All right, he hated St. Thomas Aquinas with a passion. He only tolerated Augustine because he liked St. Paul. All right, and so that's where the sort of the rise of fideism, and what that does is separates this sharp divide between faith and reason. Okay, and this is where when someone says something about Christianity and science, we have to correct them, because there is a certain element of Christianity that rejects reason, or just says it has something to do with something else, has nothing to do with faith. But you correct them and say Catholicism and science have no problem. Okay, so this is one of those cases where you can't. You got to be careful to make a distinction. All right. Then the second sort of approach is what Origen did, and Origen said, "Oh, we can take it all. It's all good." And this is why, if you sort of know the story of Origen, Origen had some pretty wacky ideas that later on were defined as heresy. So one of his was that universal salvation. He thought souls pre-existed the body, because he's a Platonist, and he thought only the people who sinned in heaven got bodies. Again, you have to get a little creative, right? And so he came up with some pretty crazy ideas that were later pointed out as heresies, although he was never formally a heretic. So he was touching on things that the church had not spoken on. All right, but this is why I think we talked about this at the very beginning, why he and Tertullian, if you look at a list of the church fathers, technically don't really appear on the list. It's also why they don't have saint, the only ones that don't have saint in front of their names. Now Tertullian went way off the reservation, but Origen never did. He died a faithful son of the church. He just had some ideas that Platonism had gotten in there. And, what were we going to ask, Andrew?
So you're saying our soul is created at the same time as our body?
Yes.
So our soul is created when we're conceived?
Yes.
Interesting.
And I will. If you guys are, we'll talk about this next week when we talk about last things. We can talk about first things too.
Also, isn't that the philosophical reason why abortion is constituted as murder? Because if it begins at conception with the soul, then you are killing both physical and spiritual entities. Yeah,
it's a person. The person is body and soul are both there. So yes. All right, and then the third sort of approach is this sort of this critical acceptance. But what I want to talk about with this is just to make sure that when we do this, that we don't get in the habit of thinking that somehow there's fideism and this sort of unrestrained acceptance as opposites. And then the church just goes, well, we'll take a little bit of faith, a little bit of reason, right? The church really says that they're complementary, right? And that's why John Paul II, in his encyclical Fides et Ratio, he calls it, faith and reason are two wings, right? Have you ever seen something fly with one wing?
Those little seeds that fall off trees.
Yeah, but technically their center of gravity is in the middle, and then they have wings on the outside, right?
I don't know. I'm just trying to be dumb.
But the point is that, like, you can't say, like, okay, well, these wings are opposite of each other, right? They're complementary to each other, right? So begin to see them as complementary. Science and faith are not contradictory; they're complementary.
I was going to say, I know this cool guy who has a blog.
There is that too. There's that. I obviously like that quote a little bit. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what the church thought about borrowing stuff from the pagans. Right? So all the church fathers, and I think this actually came from Origen, who was, if you ever read his scriptural commentaries, he's incredible. So he looks at when the Israelites leave Egypt, right? And God disposes them to give them all their gold away. You guys are really like,
I'm
just
just
take our gold, right? So they borrow their gold. And so what he says is, okay, so they get these things from Egypt.
I like the
Why? Why did God command that?
Well, they needed a lot of it in the next few chapters to build all the stuff.
Yeah.
That was a lot of gold.
Okay. Yeah, and what was one of the things they built? Golden calf. Right?
Whoops.
That's what makes it
Yeah. So in other words, they took this thing from the pagans. It was a good thing, and they had a choice. They could use it for good, or they could use it for bad. Right? They could accept it unquestioningly or not. Right?
Porque no los dos.
Yeah. Yeah. I think at one point they even have to drink it. Right? Like. I don't know what gold water tastes like, but it's probably not that great.
Poison too.
All right, so Leo the 13th, who was writing in 1870s, it's most fitting to turn these truths which have been discovered by the pagan sages even to the use and purposes of revealed doctrines, in order to show that both human wisdom and the very testimony of our adversaries serve to support the Christian faith, a method which is not a recent introduction, but of established use and has often been adopted by the Holy Fathers of the Church. What is more, those venerable men, the witnesses and guardians of religious traditions, recognize a certain form and figure of this in the action of the Hebrews, who, when about to depart out of Egypt, were commanded to take with them the gold and silver vessels and precious robes of the Egyptians, that by a change of use the things might be directed to the service of the true God, which had formerly been instruments of ignoble and superstitious rites. So this is bigger, right? This is why we borrowed things from the pagans, because they've gotten things right. Whereas the truth is, the church has no problem taking it up. All right? All right. St. Thomas. So when St. Thomas engages someone, if you've ever read even just a little bit of the Summa, first of all, he can make the arguments better than the person actually who holds the argument, which is pretty amazing. But he has this principle in which he operates every single time. All right, because you'll notice he'll always say, "Well, this is wrong," but, and he'll look at the part that's right. Right. So when someone says something, he doesn't deny it outright, right? Because falsehood always takes the truth and twists it. And so what he does is he goes and he uncovers the truth, and he latches onto that. Okay. So when someone says something, he doesn't deny it outright. All right. He also doesn't affirm it, except very seldom. Okay. But he always makes distinctions. Right, and this has always been the church's approach, right? So the church looks at Plato and says, "Yes, we agree about the theory of forms, but this part isn't right, okay? Because you have to make this distinction, right?" And so this idea of never denying, it's a good practice for all of us to get into, right? When someone says something, there's some truth in what they're saying. I mean that. It's arrogant of us to think that somebody is so totally whacked out that they're not basing something they believe on the truth, right? So in charity, this is where St. Thomas, as a mystic, comes into it, and he looks at it and he says, I'm not going to deny this completely, right? In charity, I'm gonna find the truth in what you're saying, all right? But he doesn't stop there, right? Because that's relativism, right? And he then wants to move the person from falsehood into truth. All right, so he seldom affirms. All right, and then he fills in the holes, fills in the gaps in their thinking. Okay, so this should be a model. The church really could learn a lot now from this model, because tends to be dialogue. You say what I believe. You say what you believe. I say what I believe, and then we find a language that makes it seem like we agree. All right, that's not what he's doing there. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip this for right now, and I want to talk a little bit about. So this is the beginning of his first apology, St. Justin, to the Emperor Titus, blah blah, Antonius Pius, Augustus Caesar, and to his son. So he's talking to his son Marcus Aurelius and his other son Lucius. I, Justin, present this address and petition on behalf of those of all nations who are justly hated and wantonly abused, myself being one of them.
All right, so he's presenting this argument for Christianity to the emperor. Now he's appealing to them as philosophers. He says, reason directs those who are truly pious and philosophical to honor and love only what is true, declining to follow traditional opinions if these be worthless. So what is he doing? He's calling them out a little bit. He's like, look, if you really care about the truth, then you'll listen, right? This ought to have a little bit of a Pilate and Jesus ring to it, right? His approach, okay? For not only does sound reason direct us to refuse the guidance of those who did or taught anything wrong, but it is incumbent on the lover of truth by all means, and if death be threatened, even before his own life, to choose to do and say what is right. For we have come not to flatter you by this writing, obviously, nor please you by our address, but to beg that you pass judgment after an accurate and searching investigation, not flattered by prejudice or by a desire of pleasing superstitious men, nor induced by a rational impulse or evil rumors which have long been prevalent, to give a decision which will prove to be against ourselves. All right, so he's saying, look at the truth of Christianity. Not what you've heard, not the rumors. For us, we reckon that no evil can be done us unless we are convicted as evildoers or be proved to be wicked men. And you can kill, but not hurt us. All right. So that's pretty bold, right? So what I want to sort of get at here is a couple of things. All right. So this is written probably in the year 150. All right. And it's written by a guy who has a philosophy school in Rome, Justin. So every day he's walking among his philosophers. He's still wearing the little philosophical garb, too, teaching people, engaging other philosophers. They know where to find him, right? And he's not really too concerned about that. He knows eventually, it's going to come home to roost. He knows eventually he's going to, that's why he starts out, And this sort of philosophical emperor will look at that last thing and go, oh, that sounds a little bit like Socrates, right? You can kill us, but it won't hurt us. But here's the thing that is really important. So he has this philosophical school, and he's engaging other philosophers. None of them turn him in. There's no envy. So he's engaging them, and they like him, right? Think about that for a second. They like him, totally disagrees. He's doing something that's illegal, but they never turn him in. All right, so how does he get from there to 15 years later being martyred? Well, somebody finally begins to envy him, and they turn him in. All right, and he knows it's coming. And this is after new emperor comes around, and he decides, well, I got to write him a letter too. So that's what his second apology is. And he basically says, look at the first apology, but if you want a summary, here it is. So here he is. This is from his martyrdom, the story of his martyrdom. The prefect of Rome is Rusticus. And so here is what Justin said: no right-thinking person falls from piety to impiety. So Rusticus says, just make the sacrifice and just be done. I know you're a reasonable man. It's a reasonable thing to do. And he's like, no, it's totally unreasonable to move from piety to impiety. Rusticus, the prefect, said, unless ye obey, ye shall be mercilessly punished. Justin said, through prayer we can be saved on account of our Lord Jesus Christ, even when we have been punished, because this shall become to us salvation and confidence at the more fearful and universal judgment seat of our Lord and our Savior. Saying, death has no power over me. In fact, I fear more the judgment seat of Christ than your judgment seat. Thus also said the other martyrs, do what you will, for we are Christians and do not sacrifice to idols. So he's running his school, right? And they raid his school, and they pick up him and 6 others. Okay, and they're all Christians. And so one by one, they bring them to the prefect, and he asks them a question, and they all answer no. All right, so then they take them one by one and behead them right in front of Justin. All right. And interiorly, in fact, if you read the story more, he's think of the mother in the book of Maccabees, right? He's celebrating that his disciples remain disciples. And then finally, he's the last one to be beheaded. So that was sort of how they always did it. They always took the leader, made him last, so they had to watch. But what I want to sort of talk about, and we talked about this the first week when we talked about history,
about how to read history. Okay? So what happens right after this? So it's not an accident that in Rome these philosopher kings, emperors are in charge, and that this saint comes along, God raises up a saint to respond, to get them to be reasonable. What do you think happened next? Almost immediately, like within weeks of Justin being martyred.
Conversion.
No.
Darn.
War broke out. And so if you look in the history of Rome, this is the downfall. From 165 on is when the downfall happens. Okay. Why? Is God just punishing? Or what? Why is that? Go back to the principles of how to read history. Rome had a purpose to serve. What was their purpose? So Judaism had a purpose, right? They're chosen to bring the Messiah, right? That's done. They're supposed to go with him. They didn't. What happened?
Their temple gets destroyed.
Everything gets destroyed, right? And it's almost not recognizable. Yes?
Rome's purpose was to spread Christianity to the world.
Yep. So what happens? They don't do it. The world comes to them. Literally within weeks, the barbarians are at the gates. All of them. All at once. And Marcus Aurelius has to go off and fight. And he gets lost in the fight. He ends up in his tent by himself, the Stoic, who's written these meditations on being a Stoic, and he has no help. He's lost. His Stoicism abandoned him because Christ had been offered to him, and he rejected it. And so, you can either do what God wants, or you can do what God wants, right? And Rome had a purpose. They didn't do it willingly. God did it anyway, right? That's how we're supposed to read history, right? It's not an accident that those things happened the way they happened, when they happened, right? So, same question now becomes, well, what's America's purpose, right? That's what, as a country, that's how you endure, right? You do what God wants, or you're going to do what God wants. And you have to sort of begin to discover that, right? What that is, right? So that's the Catholic way of reading history. Going back to their belief, right? Their belief was history keeps repeating itself. Nothing ever happens. And then Christianity injects this progress towards something, right? Towards the fulfillment of God's kingdom. And so that's where they left it, right? And they're like, okay, now, and that's how Christianity ends up spreading. The barbarians took it back with them. And it got twisted up into Arianism, which we'll talk about, but eventually they became Catholic too. All right, questions? Yes, come on.
So, John the Cross, there's a lot of cautioning against trusting. I think the difference is going to be between public and private revelation. He has a lot of cautioning against prophecies and mystical experiences in terms of miracles or anything. So it is, I guess, where does kind of the difference is it public and private revelation? Where does the difference lie between things we should trust and things we should not trust?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things. So I would say first, with private revelation, only trust it if the church has said it's reliable, which leaves out a lot of stuff that's happened. It just takes the church a while to come around and say, yeah, that is authentic. Because all private revelation is just really preaching on the gospel. And think about, going back to Fatima is a great example, right? That's just preaching by Our Lady about how the gospel should be lived out in our times. What John of the Cross is cautioning about is especially people that have this inordinate desire to be spoken to by Christ. And in fact, he's like, no, don't do that. He's like, you have all you need in the Gospels. Go speak to Christ there. And he's being very realistic, too, in the fact that we can be very, very easily deceived, especially when we're looking for that. And he knows that if God wants your attention, God will get your attention. Which I think we talked about when we talked about prayer, but that definitive going back to asking for signs, right? Of is this genuine or not? Because in a lot of ways, again, going back to Fatima, the miracle of the sun is an affirmation that all that the children saw was true. And we should do that in our own lives too. You think God is telling you to do something? Ask for a sign that it's really God. There's nothing unfaithful, but that's the way the saints do it.
Trust but verify.
Yeah, you should absolutely verify. Because the trust isn't not in God. The trust is not in me. Like, I know how prone I am to be deceived. And so, I'll ask for... I mean, I do that somewhat regularly. I will ask for a sign. I won't do it for basic things like, hey, you really need to go and do this for someone. But bigger things, I'll ask for signs. And then I'll ask for... Usually I have a little fun with it. I'll ask for something ridiculous. But, and because if it's really God, He's really talking to me, I'll hear Him tell me what the sign should be, and I'll ask for that sign.
Is that like the frog story?
Frog is one of those stories.
That's one of my favorite stories.
The frog is one of those stories. Yes.
You should.
Yeah, so...
it's a great story.
Yeah, so one of my boys wanted he wanted a pet. And he decided he wanted a frog. And I was like, I don't want to. What are we going to do with a frog? So I was like, just go ask God for it. And we're coming home at night. Headlights in the driveway. Frog. Gigantic. Sitting right in the middle of the headlights. Just sitting there. He just walks right up to a frog, never moves. He picks it up. He goes, here. He's like, God wanted me to have a frog. He's like, I lose.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah. But as you get older, the value of that, it seems so silly and it's a funny story, and he and I still laugh about it. But if you were to ask him, that was such a gift of faith for something so simple. Like he asked God for something and God gives it to him. That can be unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, one of my signs I often ask for is to see someone fully decked out in Patriots gear. I don't know why I asked for that. I hate the Patriots.
Any particular person, or?
Yeah, it can be anyone. Other times I'll ask to run into someone who knows my name that I don't know, or things like. So it's things like that are obviously a little bit obscure, but not like, hey, I want the moon to actually, take 2 flips in the sky for me. But you should verify whether God is actually speaking to you. That's what Our Lady did, right? Our Lady from Gabriel, that's what she got, right? She runs to minister to her because that was the sign that she had an authentic encounter with an angel of God. All right, other questions? Did I answer your question? Kind of was a really long answer to a simple question.
Yeah. Small question. Did Mary ask for a sign?
No, I guess she didn't necessarily ask for it, but it was given to her. She would have expected, like all of them, that anyone who has an encounter, you always notice there's a sign attached to it, right? Think back to Isaiah, where he tells Ahaz, ask for a sign. He's like, oh, I wouldn't ask for a sign because I'm not going to test God like that. And what he's really doing is, if I get a sign, I'm going to have to do whatever it is, right?
So why does the Lord say no sign will be given this generation?
Well, because the sign is the resurrection, right? So he's at a certain, you can see as he's growing, he's getting, it's not like he can get exasperated, but he's getting more and more exasperated that they don't believe his signs anyway. So he's like, okay, the only sign you're getting is the resurrection, which is enough, right? So he says, no sign will be given but the sign of Jonah, which is 3 days in the belly of the earth, and the resurrection. So the resurrection is the sign. So it's not that he gives no sign, that's going to be your sign. Because he was saying some pretty incredible things, right? We forget that part of it. Yes, Connor.
Could we say that the sign that Mary asked for was when she